I'll be the first to admit that Kirby games aren't exactly the pinnacle of game design. None of his games are as intricate as Metroid or as confident as the best Marios or as weirdly engrossing as something like Pikmin. But I think it's easy to ignore that in Kirby's case because his games have different priorities to the examples I just mentioned. They're platformers for beginners, and with that philosophy in mind, I think all of his games achieve what they set out to do. And because of their low difficulty and simplistic controls, they even make for pretty good comfort games. Now, it's difficult to find one mainline game that showcases these things the best, mostly because they all play pretty much the same. So to give you an idea of what I mean, I'm going to talk about a game that is close enough to the mainline games to help prove my point, while also being different enough to warrant a discussion on its own. If you've invested any time in the Kirby series since this game came out, it's likely you've heard people talk about this game before. It's not exactly obscure. In fact, I've heard a lot of people say that this game is one of their favourites. It's probably within the fanbase's top 5. And next to Return to Dreamland and Robobot, I'd say it's one of my favourites too. That may be partially because of nostalgia, but I don't think that means the game doesn't stand on its own merits. I mean, people like it for a reason. I've heard so many people talk about how pleasant this game is, and I agree with them on pretty much every point. But that's not really what I want to talk about in this video, or at least I don't want it to be the focus for the entire video. Because I noticed something during my most recent playthrough of Epic Yarn. In all of the discussions about this game I've seen, I've heard everyone talk about the music, visuals, and minor gameplay changes, but I can't remember a time I've heard someone talk about the game itself for that long. In fact, I don't think I've heard anyone talk about it at all. I can't say I blame them though, because the gameplay is probably the weakest aspect of this game. But since this is a video game review thing, I feel like it's necessary to talk about it in some capacity. I think it's worth highlighting now though, that this doesn't mean I think the game is bad. The things it does well and the way it does them more than make up for its faults. It's just that I feel like it's important to be aware of a game's shortcomings, especially when it comes to something as significant as gameplay. So, Epic Yarn is a spin-off from the Kirby series, at least Wikipedia says it is, and while it is, Wikipedia, I'm inclined to believe this line of thinking just because of the gameplay changes Epic Yarn brings to the series. Due to an incident at the start of the game, Kirby can't swallow his enemies, meaning there aren't any copy abilities, meaning a lot of the puzzles and combat sections from the other games have been removed for the most part. But it's difficult to immediately pick up on some of these changes at first, since the changes to the basic moveset still feel consistent with the rest of the series. Kirby's central ability has always been transformation, and Epic Yarn does some creative things with that concept. Instead of getting a new hat whenever he eats someone, Kirby will transform into different objects as a part of his basic movement abilities. He turns into a car when he dashes, he turns into a weight when ground pounding, and he turns into a parachute when floating. But the main ability for this game is the whip, which isn't hugely different from inhaling. The only major difference is that Kirby can't swallow his enemies to gain their powers, he can only spit them out, so to speak. Basic movement for a simplistic platformer, they knew their target audience and didn't try to overcomplicate it for them, which I think is the right move. It streamlines the core gameplay of the series, removing the at times complex copy abilities while still feeling like a Kirby game. And I think you could design a compelling platformer with these basic abilities, but unfortunately this is the one aspect of the game I could comfortably call underwhelming. The level design isn't bad, it's just forgettable. I remember having a lot of fun with the game, but only a handful of levels really stood out to me. Everything else is just a blur, and I think that's because the gameplay itself lacks variety for the most part. Almost every level in the game has a distinct theme, even within their world's general theme. But the gameplay within those levels, for the most part, is overly simplistic and kinda forgettable. Which normally wouldn't be an unfair criticism in a game that's targeting a casual audience, but considering how good the level design can get in some places, I feel like they could have done more with it. There are a handful of levels that stand out in my mind as being generally well designed, developing their themes as the level progresses in a way that feels natural. Or they'll use some other unique gimmick to keep the gameplay fresh, like a transformation or a visual gimmick. And a lot of those levels are really good, they're the levels that stick out in my mind when I think about the game. But I can only really think of like 10 of those off the top of my head. When it comes to the rest of the game, most of the levels feel like a blur. I've already said that, why do I keep saying the same thing? And this makes it especially hard to criticize the level design. I can't exactly pinpoint an overall issue with the design when I can't pinpoint anything at all. But I think if the level design has so little staying power that I'll forget a level immediately after I finish it, it's difficult to stay positive about the design as a whole. Something else I realized while working on this video is that the main series has a little more variety spread throughout its levels. Return to Dreamland, for example, has a lot of side rooms that use copy abilities or haulable items in a unique context for a shorter, more intense burst of gameplay. These moments often make simple yet creative use of familiar abilities, which not only helps them stand out more, but it also makes you think about how to use the copy abilities differently. There are even some moments along the main path that do something like this. And while Epic Yarn does have a few moments like this, I think it could have done with more of them. And off the top of my head, there are only a few examples I can think of. The first is in the level Mysterious UFO, where you use your whip to gain extra height to get a collectible. The second is in all of Dreamland, which adds those side rooms that I mentioned earlier. They don't stand out as much as Return to Dreamland, since they're mostly just cannon rooms or enemy gauntlets, but I feel like they do test the player's basic abilities a little more. But these sections are at the very end of the game, which is understandable from a difficulty standpoint. You want to put the harder parts of the game close to the end. But I think this results in the most creative and memorable parts of the game being close to the end as well, which leaves the first half and even a lot of the second half, again, bland and forgettable. And just to clarify, I'm not saying the game is easy and that's why it's bad. No doubt the biggest criticism people give to Epic Yarn is that it's easy, but that's not really the problem I have with the design. Because a lot of the game is challenging in its own way. If you want to go for 100%, you need to do a lot of the levels without taking damage, and with boss fights you need to collect beads while also avoiding their attacks to unlock the last 2 levels for each world. And you know, that's an interesting way of handling difficulty in a game where you can't die. I like that. So the difficulty is not really the issue. Yeah, I would like it more if it was a little harder, but Kirby games are supposed to be forgiving for newcomers. What I'm trying to say is that a lot of the levels in this game, especially early on, aren't especially memorable even right after I finish them. And the levels that do stand out aren't really enough to carry the game for me, especially since most of them are in the last half of the game. So with all of my criticisms in mind, you're probably wondering why I consider this game to be one of my series favorites. Surely if a game has such a weak core, it's difficult to find much enjoyment in it. And while that is mostly true, remember that I mentioned earlier that people hold this game in high regard for its soundtrack and visuals. And while this won't hold true for everyone, for me personally, they really do a lot to save the game for me. But before we talk about the music and visuals, it's probably worth mentioning that I'm probably a very small step above being completely unqualified to talk about music and visuals. I feel like I'm alright at explaining whether or not a game is well designed, but when it comes to everything else, my points are mostly going to boil down to graphic look good or music comfy. I'm a bit better at analyzing visuals than I am with music, but even then, I'm not great. Actually, because of that, I think it's best we talk about the music first, so I can give the visuals their own segment, since they're probably going to be more interesting anyway. The music of Epic Yarn is good. Honestly, I wish I had more to say about it. Almost every level has its own theme, which is pretty impressive. I think at most 2 levels in a given world will share the same song, but even when they do, the song almost always fits the levels they're played in. There are a few songs that I ironically love, like the Spaceland theme. This sounds like a song from a Warrior Land game, which I guess isn't that surprising. But there are also some songs that I unironically hate. I don't know why, but the main theme has never really sat well with me. It works well when it loops early on the title screen, but for some reason the version that plays in Flower Fields really gets under my skin. But that's mostly a nitpick. Overall, the OST is very lighthearted and comfy, even with the more intense tracks. And hey, it even has my favorite version of both Gourmet Race and Butter Building, so you know it's good. But a big part of the reason why I can't speak on the soundtrack is that you don't really need to focus on it that much while you play. It sets a tone, but that's all it really does. I think the reason why people talk about the visuals more is because they have a more direct influence on how levels are played and designed. If you look at the levels on their own and only pay attention to the platforms, obstacle and hazards, and only look at how they're placed and arranged, like I was doing earlier, it's not that great. But if you can get out of that mindset and look at the context that the visuals add to the levels, it's a lot easier to appreciate them for their creativity. My favourite example of this is in the level Big Bean Vine. Going into it, I knew it would be a vertical level, which I'm not a huge fan of. Even when they aren't auto-scrollers, most of the time you end up jumping across very standard platforms that don't make for very interesting gameplay. Big Bean Vine is designed like this as well, I will admit, but the context it adds makes it difficult to notice that right away. First of all, you're climbing a beanstalk. That already makes for more interesting level theming than almost every other vertical level, and it even manages to fit into the overall theme of Grassland. Second, a lot of the platforms you use throughout the level are actually these cute balloon and parasol Waddle Dees. which is great on its own, but there's an additional layer that makes it even better. Standing on the balloon Waddle Dees cause them to lose helium, which will eventually destroy the platform you're standing on. So you need to manage your platforms as you move to the top of the level, while making sure you don't get hit by the projectile spinning enemies. It's one of my favourite levels in the game, despite how basic it is from a gameplay standpoint because of the context that comes from the visuals. But compared to what comes later, it's fairly basic from a visual standpoint as well. I feel like it's low-hanging fruit to talk about this music level, or hell, any level from Treatland, but I feel like it'd be a disservice not to bring it up. It's a fairly simple idea, making the platforms and obstacles into instruments, but when it gets combined with Epic Yarn's mechanics, it manages to stay fresh. Using drums as bouncy platforms, yeah, we've all seen that, but swinging across a harp? Compressing an accordion to reach higher areas, snaking into a... I'm not actually sure what instrument this is, but it's still a good way to use the mechanics. And then there's this section with the pianos on the ground, which makes what would normally be a boring open space in any other platform into something fresh and interesting. I think the biggest problem with the examples I've given is that there are very few levels dedicated to exploring a singular idea visually. Those are the only two I can really think of from the top of my head. Most other levels typically use singular ideas that fit into the broader themes of the worlds rather than the themes of the levels. But that's really a small issue in the grand scheme of things, since it gives the developers more freedom with their creativity without needing to tie everything back to one central theme. I'd like to go through and dissect some of my favourite examples individually, but I think you can get the appeal behind a lot of them just by looking at the footage. So yeah, Kirby's Epic Yarn is a pretty good game. I can see how some people wouldn't get into it, but for me, it's a very accessible, very comfy game. And I'm kind of surprised that we haven't gotten a follow-up since it came out, at least not in the Kirby series. But I guess it could run the risk of being a lesser version of the same game if they end up recycling the world themes, which I could definitely see them doing. I think more variety in that area would definitely help the game stand out more. At the very least, I wouldn't mind a modern re-release on the Switch. Not only because it's been stuck on the Wii for almost a decade, but also because it looks surprisingly good when upscaled through Dolphin. And also because it would be nice to not have to play the game on a Wii remote. Epic Yarn wasn't the biggest game on the Wii though, so I could understand why they may not want to port it. But who knows, maybe if they run out of games to release, they could consider it? That's probably never going to happen, but it's nice to think about at the very least. Wait, they released a 3DS version?